Death of a loved one, the loss of a business, a serious accident, or some other traumatic event, any of these can change our lives forever. Join me to learn how we can rebuild our world after it's fallen apart. Next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. Heartbreaking events like the unexpected death of my own husband 1 month ago, and traumatic events like the mass killing in Roseburg, Oregon 1 week ago can leave us reeling in the aftermath. Tonight, we're going to talk about how we can move through pain that is frankly crushing and rebuild our lives after these events with grace and resilience. As always, your calls and questions are welcome, so call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Joining me tonight is Sabrina Matheny, the Director of Child Trauma Services at the Human Development Center. Thanks for coming in tonight. So I think it's very timely that you're here. Of course, I think it's timely for my own situation, but and I'm going to be taking notes, let me tell you. But also given the mass murder from last week's tragedy. And let's talk a little bit at first, just what people are facing and what they're needing to do to start that rebuilding in those initial 24, 48 hours after the tragedy.
Well, I think after a tragedy, those first days, hours, couple of days is really about kind of finding your feet and what are the concrete things that really need to be done, and also trying to take some time to notice what are all of the kind of myriad of emotions and thoughts that are just kind of coming usually in waves.
And I think that that's a hard thing to do when it feels like everything that you knew is now different, right? That nothing feels normal anymore.
Right. There are so many things that we do kind of unconsciously to go through our days and go through our lives and thoughts that we have. And when those significant events happen, that it really forces us to be much more aware of things that we took for granted. And so then everything seems to take more energy and more thought at a time when our capacities for energy and thought are just far lower.
And so I think what I've noticed is that taking a shower, that's a 6-step process. And what I would have told you 2 months ago was I don't know how many steps because we just do those things automatically. And I think that contributes to that sense then also of overwhelming fatigue that people have of having to think about every little step.
Right, there's thinking about every little step, and then there's thinking about how is it that I start to even move forward from this point? How is it that I can even move past the place where I'm just living kind of moment to moment? What's the next? I just put shampoo in my hair, what's next?
Exactly, and so I'd read somewhere, Sabrina, that experiencing a life-altering event like that, you feel like you have, like people who have a mild concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury because everything takes so much thought.
Absolutely, everything takes so much thought. There are so many parts to it, and sometimes it can also feel like I just can't think. And, will I ever be able to think again? So as you're trying to figure out what to do, how to rebuild, how to start to think about the world again, our capacities are far lower, and just like if you had a concussion. And so there's a part to, not only is there the emotional hurt, but then there's the kind of, I think sometimes that physical hurt of just the emotional pain wearing on us and everything just being so overwhelmingly taxing.
And then on top of it, people often aren't sleeping well, and we know what sleep deprivation does to people as well in terms of their ability to function.
Certainly not sleeping well, not eating well, not feeling hungry, those basic things that we all know, right? Drinking water, eating well, sleeping well, getting exercise. those are some of the things that also, they kind of fall off the radar.
Because doing yoga is not the first thing you think about. Maybe if your children was one of the children that was shot and killed in Roseburg in the mass murder incident.
Right, and I think even for people who aren't, like when there's mass events, even for people who may not be directly affected by it, that, you know, if you become worried about your child, if the way you think about the world gets shattered by those events, then it's possible that even yoga doesn't come into mind at that point, because you're so, you know, how you've structured the way you go through the world has been shattered by something that might even be an indirect experience.
So let's talk about that, because you just began to talk about this concept of how we move through the world and having these sort of shattered worldviews that comes out of living through a traumatic or life-changing event. So let's even talk about first, define that concept of what a worldview is and how it helps us in life.
So I think our worldviews are created by our experiences, our beliefs, kind of the society and culture that we grow up in, how our families operate, and they are really the ways that we think that the world operates, the fundamental kind of beliefs that we have that we go through the world. And they also then become kind of the fabric that we look at all of our life experiences through. And so those events that happen, whether they're traumatic or in some ways life-altering, they really kind of rip apart and cause a fraying of that fabric of the way we've kind of held our movement through the world.
So some of these worldviews are things like, if I am a good person, good things will happen to me.
Right. So one of the times that I remember having to very consciously think about my worldview was I was running a group for sexual assault survivors, and my car was broken into and a musical instrument was stolen. And it's that idea that I'm doing this kind of good thing, I'm doing my job, everything's how it's supposed to be, and then this unexpected random event happens.
And for you especially, given the work that you were doing, here it is, I mean, what I would say is you were doing this noble thing, and that didn't save you from the bad things that can happen in the world.
Right, and so much of my experience had been with kind of personal, personal violence and interpersonal violence, not this kind of random violence. And so my experiences and how I thought about things hadn't equipped me to deal. I didn't have a framework or a worldview that allowed me to integrate that really well. Rather, it forced me to kind of take that step back and say, how is it that I understand this? How is it that I start to reshape and sew back together that fabric?
Well, we talked before the show that there really are some of these worldviews can be, this is sort of the David Letterman, instead of the top 10, we're going to do the top 5 worldviews that people often experience after a traumatic or life-altering event that can be shattered, that often needs to be reworked. And so, worldview number 1, safety.
Absolutely. So this is the idea. I think the Oregon shooting is a great example of how it forces us to really confront that idea of safety. And so or the school shootings we've heard about, or kind of floods. So it can be, I'm never safe and no one is ever safe. Or it can be, who knows, life's a lottery. I might as well just kind of go do these risky things because it's not going to matter. And those can be kind of those worldviews that then make us more vulnerable. And on the flip side of that, we can have some worldviews that we recreate shaped by those events that are really about, I don't want to live my life in fear, or I need to appreciate every moment because you never know what's going to happen.
So I think the key thing that you just mentioned is that people hold a worldview whether they're aware of it or not. And a lot of what we heard initially in the news from right after the Roseburg shooting were descriptions of this kind of thing doesn't happen in this small community, that we are safe because we live in a small rural community. And so the worldview would be that kind of thing happens someplace else. I am safe by living here. That clearly was shattered for them.
Absolutely.
And then how they reconstruct that is either going to move them towards resilience or move them farther away from resilience. If you it would be hard to live with the worldview of, oh my gosh, there's no place on earth that's safe, if that's the way that some people reconstruct that then.
Right, so if we go back to the idea that our worldview is kind of the fabric that we hold our thoughts in, and that when those event happens, it rips the fabric, absolutely, there are ways of thinking that move us towards resilience, and I think those are the things that they do kind of make us stronger, that we sew the fabric together and it allows us to move forward kind of in the world and in our lives. There are other things I think of, like we just put Scotch tape on the fabric and it's going to get kind of shattered again and again and again, and it's not going to allow us to move forward in the world in a way that's helpful in the long run.
Okay, worldview number 2, intimacy.
So this is that idea that's kind of about closeness, it's about love, it can be about betrayal, it can be about loss. And so, I can be close to people. So that idea of I could never be close to anyone again, I can never be vulnerable, I can never love again, those would be kind of the beliefs that don't set ourselves up well for kind of healing after there's been some sort of kind of challenge to our thoughts about intimacy.
And so what's a good example of a situation where that particular worldview is more likely to come up?
Well, I think that particular worldview comes up a lot about loss, kind of death of people we care about.
Raising my hand.
Absolutely. I think that comes up when, like in marriages, there's been a significant kind of betrayal, or when we've been vulnerable. We've even that idea that we've shared a secret and we've been vulnerable, and that we've let ourselves kind of be seen in this way that then either gets used against us or it ends up not feeling safe.
That's a wonderful example, because I think a lot of people who haven't necessarily lived through something like the Roseburg mass murder, but have had the experience of sharing a secret only to then subsequently feel betrayed by that. A wonderful example, because I think a lot of people have had that experience. Mm-hmm. And then what you're tempted to do, or what many people are tempted to do, is to pull away from other human beings, when we know that it's our connectivity to human beings that really can be very healing for us then.
Right. I'm never going to let myself be vulnerable again is absolutely that kind of moving away from. Or, the opposite, which is still not really being vulnerable, which is I'm going to be an open book to everyone all of the time.
Oh, talk about that. And who are the people who are more vulnerable to having that as a reaction?
I think people who they have moved into those situations where, like, it doesn't matter anyway. That there's some part of it, I'm not important and I'm not worth kind of holding the sense of privacy or intimacy with people, and so therefore I go to oversharing. Or I so need to be close to people and I don't have a good way to do that. So, the people who become very intrusive, or the people who you sit down on the plane next to and they tell you their life story. That's not a true intimacy. That's kind of a false sense of it.
That's a great example, and I think many of us have had that example of sitting next to somebody on the bus or on the plane where that's been our experience then. Third worldview, trust.
Yeah, so trust, it seems like it might be a little close to intimacy, but trust is more of that, it can either be I trust myself, or how is it that I trust other people? Or how is it that I trust systems? So I, trusted the credit card company to not allow $10,000 worth of charges that weren't mine. I trusted this person with this information. I trusted that what they told me was accurate, and I acted upon that information, and it turned out to be wrong.
Talk a little bit more about trust in terms of, you deal with an awful lot of children who've been in abusive situations, and here what one of the worldviews that we hold about families, and particularly caretakers or care providers or our parents, is that those are the people who we are supposed to be able to trust most in the world. And yet for some of these children who you're helping, those are the people who have hurt the children. And how talk a little bit about what happens with a child's trust, and then how you help a child rebuild trust so that that doesn't become a burden that they carry.
Yeah, there's really two dynamics in child abusive situations that sometimes occur in families that drive that sense of broken trust. And again, it can be either I don't trust anyone or I trust everyone. And so one is the person who did the hurting. And frankly, that's kind of the least issue, right? So although we're affected by the person who's supposed to love me is the person who hurt me, that sometimes that is it has a lower impact on trust than the person who didn't necessarily hurt me but failed to protect me. So now I can't trust people who are supposed to keep me safe to keep me safe. And so now we carry that over to school, or we carry that over to kind of living in the world. I don't trust teachers to keep me safe. I don't trust that they're going to be predictable. I don't trust other adults. I certainly, I may not trust people in authority. And so one of the ways that we can work to rebuild that is by being kind of aware of the ways that, and helping kids understand the ways in which their trust was broken, and helping them look at what are some of the things that you can trust. Because the reality in moving through the world is that we trust a lot of people every day. So at that point they're trusting someone to give them food or to give them clothing or to get them to school, and so trying to highlight those things. And then also trying to look at, we want to trust people as much as they've earned our trust, and really working with kids to understand that concept. And I think that concept then also fits very well with adults.
And how really that's something that we need to learn moving into adulthood anyway, right? Which is this concept that we only trust people as much as we ought to be able to trust people. We don't just trust everyone blindly then.
Absolutely, and that we trust different people with different types of information and in different types of situations.
Esteem and competency is the fourth worldview that we were going to talk about that can be broken in a life-altering situation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is about how do we see ourselves as being effective in the world, as having skills to contribute. It's almost, how is it that we recognize our strengths? So when it gets broken, it can be those things like failures. I started this business opportunity and I lost it. I thought I could do this thing and I couldn't. I was running this marathon and I had to drop out. That those can be things that really alter how we think about ourselves. And so we can look at some of the unhelpful beliefs about I'm not good at anything, I'm a failure, or I'm good at anything and I can do whatever I want. Those are similarly unhelpful. And as we move towards resilience, it's really about the ability to appreciate what are our strengths and weaknesses, that we're all good at some things and probably less good at others.
And so what are certain life-challenging situations? I mean, you mentioned like the failed businesses being one, failed marriages. I would imagine that can affect a person's sense of competency.
I think failed marriages, I think when you have worked really hard to get a promotion and then you don't get it. I think for some parents it can be about their children. That their children didn't follow the path that they had hoped that they would follow.
Or parents who, one of the things that comes to mind is parents who have a child maybe who's involved in with drugs or becomes involved with the legal system, or God forbid dies of a drug overdose, and then parents begin questioning their competency as a parent. How did I contribute not only to the path that my child went on, but on to their demise as well?
Absolutely, and I think it can cause parents to really question and to go back, if I would have known then what I know now, I would have made a different decision. But to get to that point, frequently people have to go through the I should have known, and I am a failure because I did not know.
That's the Monday morning quarterbacking too, right? Which is using information that we have in 2015 to maybe judge decisions that we made back in 1999, and that doesn't usually lead to very good outcomes then.
Right. There's a difference between Monday morning quarterbacking, which is I would have, I should have, I could have, and from now here's what I've learned from that event. And here's what I've learned from that event does help us reconstruct a worldview that lends itself towards resiliency. The woulda, shoulda, coulda's kind of keeps us stuck in things that we have no control over anymore.
And so what would be an example of a helpful reconstruction of a worldview where competency is the issue?
I need to pay attention to warning signs. I should have trusted my intuition a little bit more because I knew something wasn't quite right. Or, I can work really hard and things might not work out the way that I want them to, but in the working hard there was kind of joy in the journey.
Or even that I can survive failure, right? That notion that I can survive failure and I can survive hardship, which I think is just so key to really having a sense of survivability about the next thing that's kind of coming down the line.
Absolutely. Sadly, there is some truth to the adage that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger.
And I found in my own situation, it's been kind of a tough year, and I could name the two things that happened before, and I look back, and I mean they weren't John dying, but getting through those events and getting through some other challenges in my life, I really feel prepared me to be able to be in a position of, okay, I know it's a day at a time. I know this will get better. I know I won't always be in this place that I am. And that makes me almost thankful for the other challenges that I've had come before me, because I don't know what it would be like if you had absolutely no experience in the world.
It's certainly true, and I think it's that we have to practice resilience, and that some of those events, they become the things that we start to kind of sharpen our skills on. And in the same way we practice free throws when it's not incredibly stressful, during practice, we can practice resiliency skills when it is the kind of the significant event that's distressing, but it's not the shattering event.
Yep, we shouldn't wait till we're in the final four to practice the free throws.
Right, a little too late.
Power and control, the last one we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting one. So this is really about how much do I control the world around me? How much control do I have? How much power do I have in my overall life?
And that sense of, I do think that one of the first things that happens is a sense of having no control, because the universe doesn't schedule the bad stuff with you. No. When it comes on the universe's time. And that is the first thing that seems to go like, oh yes, just a friendly reminder, you're not as much in charge as you think you are.
Absolutely. And that frequently we'll try to look for control, and where we wish we would have had control, or where we imagine ourselves to have control when we actually really didn't, in those initial kind of stages, those few hours, days after the big events happened.
And so part of that also is just learning to be comfortable with that fact, right? Learning to be comfortable with the fact that, oh yeah, so not in charge.
Right.
So not in charge, like I delude myself into believing.
Right. That I can only do what I can do. I can only have control over the pieces that I have control over.
Although that does free me up to do more things if I'm only in charge of me and I'm not in charge of the world. Then we're drawing close for time. What are some parting words that you would say in terms of people who have just had really a life-altering event, some hopeful words?
I think one of the things is what is it that you want to believe about the world? If you think a year from now, where do you want to be? And then trying to figure out how is it that I make meaning that moves me towards that place or that belief, because those are the things that you might not be able to hold it 24 hours a day, but if you can just get a glimpse of it as you're trying to survive moment to moment, it's going to help move you towards that reconstructed worldview.
I think that's wonderful. Wonderful advice. Lord knows I could use that advice, and I'm going to take that advice. Pauline Boss says we need to become comfortable with ambiguous loss, and really with loss of any kind, and to find hope in the imperfect endings. I think that's wise advice. Thanks so much for joining the discussion with us. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links. And now you know why I'm not blogging very much, right? I got some things on my mind. I'll get back to blogging, but I'll tell you it won't be this week. Join us again next week when we'll be talking about breaking free from an eating disorder. And I want to take one moment to say this. I wanted to dedicate the show to my dear, dear husband, John, and soulmate, Dr. John Hare, who always reminded me that Speak Your Mind is about a show about the power of human connection to instill a sense of hope. And then I realized that he would have wanted me to include you in this dedication. This community's outpouring of support to me has been lighting my path with grace and resilience, and for that, I thank all of you. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.